Welcome to the Deeper Into Movies podcast. My name is Stephen T. Hanley. I'm the founder and lead curator of Deeper Into Movies. We're a pop-up cinema based in London. Today on the podcast, Todd Haynes. Yes, Todd Haynes. Safe. I'm Not There. Velvet Goldmine. The Karen Carpenter Story. Far From Heaven. Carol! He's an amazing filmmaker, one of the godfathers of indie and queer filmmaking. He has a new documentary, The Velvet Underground. Finally, there's a VU documentary. I thought it was excellent. I thought it was dense. Great, deep exploration of the whole scene. Avant-garde music, underground filmmaking, literature, poetry. He went deep. I should say, as I mentioned to Todd during our chat, that his audio commentary for the Bob Dylan biopic, I'm Not There, is insane. It's literally like a 2-hour lecture. He's just got notes, inspirations for the films, photography, essays, film thinking, interview excerpts. Keep that in. Fuck it. Excerpts. It's so great. I walked away knowing way more about Bob Dylan than I ever thought I would. Anyway, me and Todd Haynes talking about the Velvet Underground and his approach to assembling this amazing documentary. So let's start at the beginning. When did you first get the idea to make a VU documentary?
The whole project was sort of brought to me in this case after a series of events where I think Laurie Anderson had handed off the Lou Reed archives to the New York City Public Library. And then people at UMG Verve, where the masters reside, David Blackman, who runs film and television there, spoke to Laurie and said, do you think this might be a time to maybe, create a more in-depth film or documentary about the band? And if so, who might be a director that she would feel comfortable about pursuing? So David came to me and my producer, Christine Vachon. This was 2017. Now, this was the first documentary I've ever made, but there was no question in my mind. I was absolutely interested from the get-go.
And how was it? I've heard people say before that documentaries have been attempted, but people get scared because there's so little footage of the band. Was that exciting for you, or was that daunting, or both?
That was exciting for me because I knew that where the footage of the Velvet Underground resided, the little there is in the films of Andy Warhol, and that they occupied this incredibly rare and sort of unprecedented relationship to the New York City art scene of the 60s. And so much of it had to do with avant-garde filmmaking that was happening at the time. And they various band members had very close relationships with other experimental filmmakers, Jack Smith, Piero Helixer, Barbara Rubin, Marie Menken. And so all of a sudden it was like, wow, this is actually less than a limitation. This is an opportunity to dive into that world and let those films and those filmmakers' visions sort of be the way we visualize this story.
Mm-hmm. The thing that threw me at first, and it's the thing now that I can't stop thinking about, that's a compliment if it doesn't sound like one, was this wild opening you have just focusing on the avant-garde music at the time and the underground films, and you open with Tony Conrad and John Cage. And I was thinking, when's the Velvet Underground going to start? But that was such a audacious opening. Can you talk about that and why you chose that approach?
It's funny. I was watching the film. I don't watch it at every festival that I've been visiting these days. And I was at Telluride, and I was watching the film, and I was at that point in that first act of the film, and thinking, wow, people are going to forget what they're watching. They're going to forget. Wait, what movie is this again? And I actually thought that. I mean, that was always the intention, to go very deep into the sort of origins, the excavating of where the sound came from, and how these very different artists, like in John Cale and Lou Reed, and the different kinds of musical influences that were driving them, how they found each other, and what that means about the music. But what I think that sense of disorientation does is it helps you come to the music with fresh ears. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, right, this is a Velvet Underground movie. And now the Velvet Underground has finally come together. And when we finally do get to the first cut in the film, which is Venus in Furs, that's from the first record, it's the same music we use for the opening credits, but now it's the vocal and the full, complete, you really feel like you've traveled somewhere. And that ideally it sort of jolts the ear into recognizing the music in a way that you hadn't before.
Yeah, and I love the fact that throughout the whole documentary, you're planting all the foundations in DNA. Like you have the Burroughs and Hubert Selby and Kenneth Anger. That all kind of formulates the DNA and influences of the band, which were much literate and film as they were musical.
Exactly. I mean, this is, I would say that, when I did a film about Bob Dylan, I'm Not There, there was a dramatic but sort of experimental approach to a biopic using multiple actors to play Bob Dylan. And it was this, when one really delves into the creative life of the 1960s, and this is particularly true in New York, what you see are amazing layers of influences coming from poetry and literature and various strains of American music and other music outside of the United States, all coming together in this sort of, cross-pollinating, very fertile territory where people are swapping ideas. But but I would say yet again with the Velvet Underground, it's still a more underground and sort of more degenerate kind of culture, of transgressive art and artists that was influencing Lou Reed, and a more experimental culture influencing John Cale.
Yeah, I remember when I had the I'm Not There DVD, your audio commentary is fantastic. It's literally lecture on music, film, all the influences of Bob Dylan, all the bootlegs. You're quoting other music fingers and stuff. It was an amazing... Yeah, but that in itself was a homework and a whole bunch of other things to explore and take away after the movie. I want to talk about your framing. You use this really incredible split screen, and again, it's almost like through the sides and there's almost the Academy ratio to one side and then the 2:4 squares otherwise. It looks like you've edited probably 6 films altogether going through this.
We licensed 2.5 hours of footage for a 2-hour-long movie, most of which is the avant-garde films, and probably 45 minutes of which is just Warhol films alone. But you're so right on to identify the Academy frame, and that's the 1:3:3 aspect ratio that's associated with 16 millimeter filmmaking. And that became the kind of, sort of box that was the sort of informative graphic element that I wanted to build the entire film around within a 1:8:5 aspect ratio, which is our standard aspect ratio today. And think about all the ways that 1:3:3 Academy frame can fit within the 1:8:5. And of course, it starts in the diptych, a la Andy Warhol's Chelsea Girls, which was a dual projector film that he shot with two 60 millimeter projectors side by side. And that pushes the two frames to this sounds really nerdy, but actually it was just pure graphic, creative pleasure for me, because we really get into, as you'll see, and people who've seen the film can't help but comment upon the multi-frame strategies that are used throughout the movie, because they're seductive. They're not intellectual. They draw you in to the language of the times, the movement of the times, and experiments that were going on within optical printers in 60s experimental film, even coming out of like Charles and Ray Eames' industrial films from the late 50s, and going all the way to feature films, dramatic films like Fleischer's The Boston Strangler in 1968.
Oh yeah,
that
of
is
course.
Beautifully constructed multi-frame passages throughout that whole film. Again, that's coming right out of the avant-garde.
Right. Was that before De Palma?
I think that was definitely before De Palma. You know what other movie I forget about is Woodstock, which uses multi-frames all the way through the film, because they have so much footage and they're trying to think about how to show you the audience and the performers and details of the crowd and the weather and all that stuff at the same time. And so they build this really interesting graphic, montage basically on the frame.
Yeah, because I love when you finally go, is it heroin that you're using as this climaxing, and then you end on that full screen photo of the band?
Well, Heroin is the first sequence inside the factory, and it ends with a sort of rapid fire montage of stills from the factory era.
Yeah.
But there is that point where we go into a grid. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to.
No, it's one where you go completely full screen, which was such a sensory shock.
Yeah, exactly. Because the variation would be 2 1:3:3 squares, 4 1:3:3 squares, which we used for the Stan Brakhage film during Pale Blue Eyes. Sometimes an entire grid of squares for the 60s montage. And then, as you say, we go fully inside a single 16 millimeter frame for several parts of it, like in the Boston Tea Party sequence in Boston, and others, where you feel the most immersion. But what we also did was, for all the interviews that we conducted, we put them into the 1:3:3 aspect ratio, flush left or flush right in the frame. So they're in little squares. They're in big squares with a black border on the other side of the frame.
Let's talk about your interviews. How did you go about selecting, obviously, people outside of the band? It's great to see Jonathan Richman.
Oh, God, yeah.
What an amazing guy.
The criteria for me, and this simplified things immeasurably when you're talking about the Velvet Underground, was to basically say, okay, we're going to dive into the time and place and really make that cultural moment come alive as much as possible. And therefore, I want to limit the people I talk to people who were there and who are still with us, which means, countless brilliant musicians, critics, artists that followed the years of the Velvet Underground and who could tell us a great deal about how the Velvet Underground affected them, were just excluded right off the bat. And you sort of see that more in other docs or passages about the Velvets in a Warhol documentary, where critics will say, this is what makes them important, I wanted the film to let the audience figure that out for themselves. But in the case of Jonathan Richman, for instance, who was there. He was a teenager in Boston for 60 to 70 shows. He was the, live-in sort of mascot house boy or whatever, buddy of the band, driving them to the parties in his mother's station wagon after shows, so into this band. Learned how to play guitar by Sterling Morrison, opened for the band at some point when he was just starting to make music himself. He served as both musician who was influenced by the band, fan, and witness. So he with all of that incredible enthusiasm and love for the band and sort of gratitude for how generous they were to him.
Was there anyone you wanted to get but didn't want to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Doug Yule is the most would top that list. He's alive. We went to him numerous times. We just pleaded with him to participate. I really wanted his voice in the movie. I was not trying to exclude Doug Yule, who is often excluded in discussions about the Velvet Underground. He's an environmentalist. It was the end of the last years of the Trump era. He, I think, was engaged in other kinds of activities. I get it. And I think people, there are times in people's lives where they're ready to talk about, their early life and history, and there are times where they want to be engaged in what they're doing now. So I do get that. But it was a loss for the film, for sure. Gerard Malanga was also somebody we really tried to get on film, and he was reluctant, and I think his presence is felt. I think both of their presences are felt with what we could find, but I would have loved to have had both of them participate.
And how was it speaking to Lou Reed's sister?
It was intense, actually, as you can see. She was worried about the way these sort of myths about Lou Reed's family have been circulated time and again in biographies, starting with Lou Reed's own accounts of his shock treatment himself. And she was sort of there and she loves, of course, she loves her brother and adores his memory and his work. But I think she also felt like it was too easy and too simplistic to simply blame parents for a kind of homophobic fixation on their son, when in fact, Lou was a complicated teenage kid who exhibited a lot of the same issues and hostilities and defenses that I think people would describe in him later in his life, throughout his whole life. But so she was on guard. I wanted that statement to be intact in the film, to show her perspective. But I have to say, I just saw Meryl at the premiere in New York, at the New York Film Festival, with her son and with Sylvia Reed, who was married to Lou Reed for 20 years, and people who knew Lou very, very well. And they really appreciated the film. And Meryl was very, very moved by it and said, she said, "You are now a member of the Reed family, Todd," which was very, very touching.
I was wondering, from your previous music films, the Karen Carpenter Story, Bob Dylan, Velvet Goldmine, what have you learned previously from your music film experiences that you took onto this?
It's a good question, phrased that way. I mean, I think, they're all quite different subjects, obviously. I mean, one can probably more closely put together Velvet Underground, which is sort of a prequel to Velvet Goldmine.
Right, yeah.
But in many, and in ways, the glam rock era is almost hard to conceptualize or imagine without the Velvet Underground, as arguably is punk rock, which followed the glam era. And Bob Dylan was a force, kind of hovering over the New York art scene, music and art and cultural scene in the 60s. And they tried very hard to pretend that they were aloof from Bob Dylan, the Velvets. But I think everybody was interested in what Bob Dylan was doing, whether they admitted it or not. But I think in all these, this is mostly music I love and has made an impact on my life personally. These different musicians and movements. But I think the reason there's plenty of other music I love that I would not necessarily make a film about. It's more how the music and the artists and the sort of have changed the culture, affect the culture in some way that is noticeable, or how the culture makes such an impact on them that they have a necessity of having to express it musically and artistically. And in the case of Karen Carpenter, of course, who sort of is an outlier in some of these other artists, it's about that music has a specific memory for me as a kid, but it's so much more about issues around illness and femininity and what it means to be a young woman in the spotlight, and how that affected her in a pop context, and the unique pressures of family that surrounded her life.
What was the biggest challenge you faced making this documentary, if you could pick one?
Not having Lou. Right. There's no question that was the structuring absence of the film. That the film, had he been alive, he would have been somebody I would have wanted to speak to right away. I would need his approval. I would want his permission. I would want his sanction to do this to begin with. And it would have been a different film. And I don't know what kind of film that would have been, how different a film it would have been had he been here. But limitations can inspire you also, and create creative necessities for how to deal with them, and force you to think about your choices in a lot of different ways that without them you may not go in as deeply on some of those things. And so we scoured the history of Lou Reed talking about the Velvet Underground in all of his interviews. I wasn't interested in showing clips from all the different eras on videotape, and it wasn't part of the sort of aesthetic language of the film. But his voice is such a huge, and his statements are such a huge part of it. Of course, his images in the photo archives we have, in the films we have. But it also means that those interview clips that we have at the end of the film land with, I think, a greater impact and poignance because we haven't been watching Lou speaking on camera, and because we haven't seen him performing live as he does at the end with John Cale in that reunion clip from Paris.
And finally, I was wondering, after having so many years of doing a deep dive into Velvet Underground, how has your relationship changed with music? Do you have a new favorite album or Lou solo record that you discovered along your journey?
I don't think it changed. It just deepened my appreciation and my relationship to all of this this music. I feel like I got to know the music, the work of Lamont Young, and in a much deeper, in a way I hadn't before this film. That was extraordinary. But the thing that's so unique about the Velvets is they only put out 4 records, and then they disbanded. And most people are most familiar with the first record, Velvet Underground, Nico, the Banana record. And it's a hugely influential record. It's now, probably rated the most, the best record of the 1960s by Pitchfork or what have you, which took a long time in coming to get to that kind of status, particularly for that decade. But the amazing thing is how they're all so different from the next. Each record is so coherent in its own style and sensibility, and they're quite different. Maybe that's least true for the last record, Loaded, which is more of feels a little bit more like a collection of songs and a kind of preview of coming attractions for the imminent solo career of Lou Reed. And that Mo doesn't play drums on it, I think, doesn't bind that album together in quite the same way as the others. But those first 3 records are just so comprehensive and thorough as musical statements. They're almost concept records unto themselves. And it's amazing, concentrated amount of work for such a short time.
I agree. Even Loaded has some great tracks.
Oh God, Loaded has just one great track after the next.
Yeah.
No, without a doubt.
Okay, this has been such a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your services to cinema.
Take care.
Thank you, buddy. Boom. There we go. Me and Todd Haynes. What a fantastic guy. I love it when you talk to directors that you've loved for so long and they turn out to be awesome, interesting people. Okay. I'm excited. Thanks as always to my engineer, Ewan Hinselwood, who makes the podcast possible and sound nice. Joshua Eustace, aka Telephone Tel Aviv, for my beautiful music. And you guys for listening. These podcast guests are getting crazy. It's so exciting. I'm happy, and I'll see you next time.